Brad Matsen is an author whose most recent book explores the lives of William Beebe and Otis Barton. It's called Descent, The Heroic Discovery of the Abyss. What's the abyss?
Well, the abyss is a word that literally means the depths, and in fact it means the empty depths. I use it to refer to the deep ocean beyond about 60 feet.
So is that sort of an archaic term for what's there? Because we know that's not the case.
Well, yes, of course it is. And in fact, we now know that there's life all the way down to the very bottom of the deepest parts of the ocean. I mean, but there was a time very shortly before William Beebe and Otis Barton explored in their bathysphere when the best scientists really believed that there was nothing in the depths. Right. That it was completely empty.
Did they have anything to base that on?
Not really. The exploration of the ocean really proceeded from the shoreline, of course. As, you can consider the first person who ever waded into the ocean to be the first ocean explorer, and then sort of looked down into a tide pool and said, "Oh, what is that?" Well, from there we learned how to pump air down to helmets about a couple of hundred years ago, and then people could walk around to depths of about 60 feet. And the British sent an expedition, the Challenger expedition. They refitted a British Navy corvette with specimen tanks and huge tanks for ropes that could reach the bottom of the ocean. And, of course, their commercial intent was to find out if they could lay a cable across the Atlantic Ocean. But peripherally, they were also interested in trying to discover whether or not some of the ancient forms that Darwin had used in his evaluation of ancient time, geologic time, still existed on the sea floor or in the abyss. So Challenger spent 4 years going around the world, and it was really the first systematic exploration of the entire ocean.
When was that?
That was right about the time we were messing around with the Civil War. In the United States.
So that was a remarkable feat of engineering and high tech of that day. It had to be.
Absolutely. The Challenger expedition is quite wonderful. They produced a 52-volume set cataloging their specimens and their methods. It was really a very exciting time.
So quite a bit later, we have the story of William Beebe and Otis Barton, who would you call them? Beebe was an explorer. Barton wanted to be an explorer. I guess he became an explorer.
Yes, William Beebe was arguably the most famous naturalist of his time. He was born in 1877, so he was reaching maturity at the turn of the century. He was a dyed-in-the-wool Victorian scientist. He didn't have any science credentials at all. He was a great fundraiser, and there was no government money in science in those days, and Beebe gave lectures and wrote articles in popular magazines. By the time he dove in the bathysphere, he had written 15 books. And many of them bestsellers, both novels and nonfiction books.
Is that quite a feat from someone without I'm losing my train of thought, without an academic degree?
Well, what's interesting about that, really, and we see the same thing with Carl Sagan. When somebody decides to become a popularizer, almost inevitably the scientific community is going to start shooting at that person, and they did with Sagan, and Carl Sagan, who produced the great television series The Cosmos, which was possibly he became the greatest teacher in the world when about 500 million people around the world saw that series.
He reached a lot of people.
He reached a lot of people. William Beebe reached a lot of people too, and he was a very dashing character. He was at the time that he and Barton got together, Beebe was just about 50 years old. Barton was 28 years old. And Barton had inherited a fortune from a family that made their money in the textile mills of New Hampshire. But he lived in New York, was born in New York. Beebe was born in Brooklyn. Otis Barton was born in Manhattan. And they were about as different as two men could be. William Beebe was absolutely disciplined. He ran his life by a rigid Victorian code. He was a bon vivant. He was a supreme intellect. Fascinating character, man about town. Otis Barton, on the other hand, was sort of a misfit. He was a kid who probably was dyslexic. He probably had learning disabilities. He wasn't very pleasant to be around by all accounts. But he was an engineer, and he was incredibly curious. And when he was a teenager at his family cottage on Vineyard Sound in Massachusetts, he built himself a diving helmet and walked around on the bottom of Catuit Harbor And from then on, he really sort of fashioned himself after the great swashbuckling explorers, the Indiana Jones types, and he kind of had a fantasy life about this. Well, eventually, he's finally graduated from Harvard. He's taken a trip around the world he did do what all the young men did in those days, was go on safari. Went around, came back to New York, and enrolled in the engineering school at Columbia University, which doesn't really mean much. Everybody talks about Otis being an engineer, but he wasn't much of an artist. I've seen some of his childhood drawings. He really even wasn't much of an engineer, but he had an amazing capacity for imagination. And he really designed the bathysphere around the concept of the infinite arc, which is what a sphere is.
So it's a classic geometric idea?
Precisely.
Yeah.
And Barton was also aware enough and could reach, because of his stature in society, could reach experts in various fields, so he could understand that what the water pressure was going to be like after you descended. You need to understand that water pressure is very interesting. Here on Earth, the human body is an organism that is designed to operate perfectly. It's a mechanical organism that operates perfectly at 14.7 pounds per square inch of air. And that, if you take a square inch and put it, imagine it on your body, and then project it all the way up to the top of the atmosphere, about 60 miles, the weight of that column of air is 14.7 pounds. Of that 14.7 pounds, 20% is oxygen, roughly, and roughly 80% is nitrogen. There are some other gases thrown in there, too. But the deal is that here we got this body that functions perfectly at this pressure in this eyelash of territory on the surface of the Earth. If you go 33 feet down, that same inch on your body weighs another atmosphere, or another 14.7 pounds. And as you keep going down, the weight of water increases by 1 atmosphere every 33 feet. Barton knew this. He knew that he was going to have something strong enough to be able to withstand that pressure. He also knew he was going to have to be able to breathe. He knew he had to find some way to look outside. Otherwise, there wasn't much point in going.
So it was more than just having a structure that could bring them down to the ocean. They had to have the technology and the air and other equipment to be able to survive, and they all knew that.
Exactly, and there really weren't any other great efforts to do this at the time. And one of the things that I eventually concluded in working on this book was that it was not only the confluence of William Beebe, who was a famous naturalist, and Otis Barton, who was a great imaginer, but it was also a coincidence of technology. They had to have a cable to lower this thing. Well, the Roebling brothers, who built the Brooklyn Bridge, were designing fabulous non-snarling cables for elevators as the New York skyscrapers were being built. All this was taking place in the 20s and 30s. So that technology arrived. Another technology that arrived at the same time was quartz glass. It's fused quartz glass, actually, and it's a way of making glass under extreme pressure with extremely pure silicone material that produced a distortion-free, amazingly strong piece of glass. Well, Otis Barton convinced General Electric to make the 3 largest pieces of quartz glass ever made for his bathysphere, and they were plugs 3 inches thick and 8 inches in diameter. And before that, the largest quartz glass ever made was about the size of a teardrop. So he really not only took advantage of the technology but pushed it forward.
Well,
finally, they had to figure out a way to breathe, and of course there was some technology in compressed gas and regulator valves to allow them to use it.
So Barton was able to manipulate and use technology. It must have been quite a feat to be able to find it. And today communication is easy.
Right. New York, of course, was a big center for this, and Otis had plenty of money.
Yeah.
So he was able to move around and make contacts. Beebe was not mechanical at all. That's another sort of aspect of their collaboration. Beebe certainly got the lion's share of the publicity. It was always in headlines in the newspapers. And believe me, after their first dives in 1930, they made their first dive on June 6, 1930. These men became international celebrities, like the Rolling Stones. I mean, they were on the front page of every paper in the world. It was huge.
Was Beebe was very well known before that. Did it eclipse that status?
Very much so. In fact, Beebe had decided to explore the ocean. He was a very famous ornithologist. That was his field. He was a birder. Excuse me. And he was an expert in jungle ecology. William Beebe was one of the very first people who realized that instead of just studying animals, you had to study their neighborhoods too, which is very obvious to all of us now because we're all ecologists. But Beebe was really one of the first to ever figure that out.
So could you compare him today to someone like Robert Ballard? Would that be a comparable kind of...
I'd compare Otis to Ballard, and I'd compare Beebe to E.O. Wilson.
Yeah.
Would be more apt comparison. Beebe very much wanted to be accepted by the scientific community, even though they were pretty harsh on him for some of the discoveries that he made in the bathysphere. And also when Beebe would publish articles in Red Book and Ladies' Home Journal and places like that, the scientific establishment would just blanch.
Well, he knew what it'd take to claim his right in the public eye by writing for the magazines like that.
Exactly, and he had written wonderful books on birds and jungles, and then in 1925 he was on an expedition off the Galapagos Islands when he made his first helmet dive. And that very day, he came back up on the deck of the boat and he said, "I'm changing careers." I mean, he didn't really say that.
Brad, could you hold on? Could you hold on 1 second? I got the phone ringing off the hook here.
Certainly. Yeah.
You can't get away from the world, no matter how hard you try.
Even in the bathysphere, they had a telephone.
You think that of a telephone in the bathysphere as being a sort of an intrusive, but it really was the beginning of the media being ever so important.
Yeah, Beebe and Barton got Bell Laboratories to design a special system for them. They had one of the challenges that Otis Barton and his marine architect, a man named Butler, faced was figuring out a way to get an electrical cable into the bathysphere and a phone cable. They put it into the bathysphere through what's called a stuffing box, which is what's used for the propellers of ships. It's a kind of a gland, two fittings screwed together with some tarred jute in between. But they had never tested this at pressure, of course. The one thing you really want to remember, David, is that these guys were incredibly brave. Nobody had ever done anything like this before.
Well, from the description of your book, you did describe some fear in them as they locked themselves into this thing and were descending. Yes.
When they made their first dive to 800 feet off Bermuda, which is where Beebe had a research station on an island, another thing that he pioneered, the concept of a research station where you study something many, many years instead of just going and leaving. Anyway, they made their first dive to 800 feet, and on the way down, they had a fire, an electrical fire, and they had a leak in the thing. They eventually called a halt at 800 feet. By this time, of course, they've gone 3 times deeper than anybody else has ever gone before and lived to tell about it, and they've gone right to the edge of the eternal darkness of the ocean. The ocean is pitch dark beyond 1,900 feet, but beyond about 600 feet, it's very dark.
It's remarkable that they survived that.
It is, and in fact, they were terrified, and up on the deck of the boat, which it was an old British Navy barge called the Ready, and on which they'd mounted a winch, and with the Roebling cable spooling down and lowering the bathysphere and raising it up. There was no hope of rescue if the barge sank or the cable broke or even if it became tangled. And up on deck, they had the other end of the phone line, which was handled by a woman named Gloria Hollister, who was incidentally Beebe's girlfriend at the time, even though Beebe was married as well. But Beebe kind of got around, as from what I gather. But Gloria Hollister later went on to found the Nature Conservancy. She herself was a great ichthyologist and quite an explorer. But Gloria stood up on deck and wrote everything down that they said as they descended in the bathysphere. And on the first dive, of course, they had made an agreement that someone would speak every 5 seconds to make sure that that she could be assured that they were still alive. And
right.
If they failed to talk every 5 seconds, they would immediately pull them up.
This was comparable to the lunar landing at the time.
Oh, without a doubt. And in fact, one of the amazing things about the joy of research on this book was that I found the original bathysphere in a outdoor storage yard under the roller coaster in Coney Island, New York.
Now, that's quite a story in itself.
It was really wonderful. coming across it, it was like you said, comparing it to the space program, it was like finding the Apollo capsule. It was really quite amazing.
So how did that come about? I mean,
I had been asked by a publisher to write a children's book on Beebe and Barton and the Bathysphere, and it was it was only 5,000 words, and they really just wanted the surface of the story. And I talked to quite a few people about it, and everybody had the same story to tell me, which led me to believe that there was a much better story underneath somewhere.
Yeah.
But in the process of doing that, my daughter, Laura Matsen, who is a writer and photographer, and also a terrific photo editor, she was doing the photo editing for this children's book, and I called her up one day and I said, where is this Bathysphere now? And so she did a little bit of poking around, called me back a couple of days later and said, you're not going to believe this, Dad, but it's still owned by the Wildlife Conservation Society, which is the institutional descendant of the Bronx Zoo, the New York Zoological Society, where Beebe was officially the director of Department of Tropical Research. Anyway, WCS, the Wildlife Conservation Society, still owns it. They manage the New York Aquarium, which is right next door to the Cyclone roller coaster in Coney Island. One of their outdoor storage yards is right under the roller coaster, and Laura jumped on an F train one day and went out there and found it. And then she called me, and next time I was in New York, I went out myself.
It's hard to believe that an artifact of that magnitude would be, virtually unknown.
Well, finally, the people at Wildlife Conservation Society were very helpful to me. They allowed me access to research, or to archives and photographs, and so when I was publishing the book, I asked my editor to send them a copy of the manuscript as a courtesy, not as an approval, but so that they could have a look at it. And in the part of the book where I talk about discovering the bathysphere under the cyclone, I live in New York. I live way downtown in Chelsea, and the Bronx Zoo is way up north in the Bronx. But I could sense the vibrations as they read that, and thought, "Oh my God, this guy's written a book, and we're going to look like fools," and on and on and on. And so they resurrected the bathysphere, and now it's back on display at the New York Aquarium. You can go see it.
And where it should be, where it really should be.
Exactly. I mean, it's an artifact of immense importance to the discovery of our relationship with the ocean. I mean, that's what Beebe and Barton did. They introduced us to an ocean that became very, very real, in the same way that Jacques Cousteau would later do with mass media.
Right. So the bathysphere as a device was a tiny thing.
Yeah, it was. Really quite something. As I think I said a couple of times already, nobody had ever done this before, and nobody had ever cast anything like this. Boilers were made by riveting them together, and that wouldn't work because the pressure would be too great. It was cast at a foundry in Buffalo, New York, by men who were experienced casting cathedral bells, and it was 4.5 feet in diameter. The walls, which were of another technological confluence, Bessemer steel had finally come around, which is a very hard, pure form of steel, a kind of steel that, because of the way they heat it and cool it, it takes the air bubbles out, which makes it stronger. So they cast it out of Bessemer steel. It's about 1/2 inch thick, the walls of the bathysphere. And then they brought it down to New Jersey, where it was finished off and the windows put in after General Electric finished making them. It weighed, they actually cast one in 1929 that weighed 5 tons. And when they were organizing their logistics, this was a lot like a couple of kids playing in their backyard some of the time.
Right.
But they hadn't figured out that there wasn't a winch big enough to lift the thing in Bermuda if it weighed 5 tons. They just didn't figure it out. And so when they finally realized that, they melted that bathysphere down and cast another one that was half the weight, but still safe enough for a descent to 3,000 feet. With the original bathysphere, they thought they could go to 1 mile, but now the goal became 1/2 mile, and they went slightly beyond that.
Based on the limitations of the technology.
Yes. Also, they wanted a safety factor of 5 times.
Yeah.
So they really wanted to be sure that they survived this.
So what inspired you to write a book about Beebe and Barton?
Well, I've lived around the ocean all my life. I've been a marine writer for 30 years in a variety of magazines, and I've written other books on the marine environment, Planet Ocean, the story of life, the sea, and dancing to the fossil record. And as anyone who studies, nature knows that all life emerged from the sea. And so I've been fascinated with the ocean for years and years. And when I finished this children's book, I realized, holy mackerel, nobody's really kind of written an intimate story about these two marvelous men and their gang on Nonsuch Island in Bermuda. They're just wonderful people. Gloria Hollister, the founder of the Nature Conservancy, and John T. Van, who became the director of the zoo, and Jocelyn Crane, who became one of the world's great experts on crustaceans, wrote the definitive book on hermit crabs or fiddler crabs. Anyway, all these wonderful people around these two guys and this incredible adventure. And the more I got into it, the more I realized that I was going to have to live with it for 2 or 3 years.
And you did, and a marvelous book ensued. You grew up in Connecticut, in Black Rock and Devon?
Yes. Well, I was born in Bridgeport, Connecticut, and my family, my mother's side of my family and my father's side, lived in Black Rock. And my father was a soldier, so we moved around quite a bit.
Right.
But home was always coming back to Bridgeport. Until about, I think we left there finally in the late 50s, early 60s. We were living in Devon, which at that time was just sort of a kind of a treeless suburb. I understand it's gotten quite nice now.
Yeah. Do you think, is there anything growing up in Devon or, an area near the sea perked your interest in exploring the oceans?
It might have. I remember going fishing, of course, out of Black Rock. I mean, flounders is what I remember catching mostly, and using red bloodworms for bait. So, the ocean was always part of my life. I've never lived more than 5 miles from the ocean. I was a fisherman in Alaska when I was a young man. Spent a lot of time in my wheelhouse wondering what was under the keel. So it was pretty great to discover not only Beebe and Barton, but I've also written about other deep ocean events, the discovery of the Titanic and some others. But it's not a bad way to expend curiosity, to wonder what's in the ocean and how do you get there.
Right.
How did people do it?
But some of your sea routes are in Black Rock. Have you ever been out to in Devon to what's the peninsula that goes way out to that hotel that used to be out there and in Devon, out on the shore, way out?
I'm not quite sure which one you're talking about. It's across the Housatonic River, right?
Yeah.
The Housatonic runs right by Devon there, and and I do remember going out on boats on the river.
Yeah.
And also, I don't know if it's still there, but there was this great amusement park called Pleasure Beach.
Long gone.
Long gone, but they had a great roller coaster that was actually, I think, built by the same people who built the Cyclone in Coney Island.
Well, there are similarities.
Yeah. So Pleasure Beach was really wonderful. That was the big day trip for me.
Right. Well, let's get back to Beebe, and let me ask you why he's virtually, if when you were a kid and you went to the library, the library be full of his books. Yes.
Actually, Beebe, after the Bathysphere, excuse me, given their different personalities, Beebe and Barton weren't even speaking to each other after their third season of diving.
Right.
In their first season, they were both primarily terrified. Their second season, the depression had thickened so badly that they had a hard time raising money, and they made a deal with David Sarnoff to actually broadcast over the National Broadcasting Corporation around the United States and in England. It was the first radio broadcast from a field science expedition. And then in 1934, they went back with some money from National Geographic. And after they finished their dives, the deepest one was to 3,028 feet.
Now, this is in the same bathysphere, not a...
Yes, no, it's the same one. They refurbished it, put new windows in it, put a new oxygen system in it in 1934. But it was the same bathysphere. And after they made their last dive, they never spoke to each other again.
Right.
So these two men were on the outs, and Beebe was battered by the scientific establishment because he had taxonomically described and named four species of fish that he saw out the window. And the academics of the time, the ichthyologists, really gave him a hard time about that. So after the bathysphere dives, Beebe never went back in the ocean again. He went and lived on an island in the Caribbean and returned to studying jungle. continued to write, but he only wrote 3 more books after the Bathysphere. He wrote a book about the Bathysphere expeditions called Half Mile Down. Otis Barton wrote one called The World Beneath the Sea. He had a ghostwriter write it, and Otis Barton also produced a film called Titans of the Deep, which was a renowned failure. And when Titans of the Deep came out, Beebe publicly wrote to the New York Times, the New Yorker magazine, several other magazines, disclaiming any association with Barton's film or with Barton himself.
And it really shows the nasty tones between the two of them at that point.
Very, very much. However, Barton did become kind of the grand old man of the ocean. He later built another bathysphere in the 50s, and on behalf of Life magazine, made a couple of dives in that. They weren't very successful. He called it a bentoscope. But he kept showing up. He had kind of wacky ideas. He had a tree climbing apparatus that he tried to get going for climbing trees in the jungle to study the jungle canopy. And he had...
No, that has to be a tree climbing machine. That has to be an innovation of some kind.
It was astonishing, and the big problem with it was Otis was kind of a bumbler, and the big problem with the tree climbing machine was that it made so much noise that it scared all the wildlife away.
Right.
So, but anyway, both Barton and Beebe inspired the first generation of real deep ocean explorers, including Bob Ballard, James Cameron, everyone who you can think of who is, and I won't run names down because they won't mean much to your listeners, but
right.
Well, one that might would be Sylvia Earle, and William Beebe was one of Sylvia Earle's great heroes. Eugenie Clark, another name people might recognize as a great deep ocean explorer. They all credit Beebe and Barton to a degree, but mostly Beebe, as being an inspiration to them to explore the ocean. Plus, Beebe's role as an ecologist is huge. Rachel Carson of Silent Spring fame, that wonderful book that really started the ecology movement in the United States, dedicated her next book to William Beebe. It was a book about the ocean.
Right.
And so they were very well known and honored, but so you can imagine how delighted I was to find out that nobody had really written a book about them.
And it's still surprising to me that aside from your book and Carol Gould's book about Beebe, there's nothing on the library shelves.
No, there isn't. Carol's biography is terrific. It's an account of Beebe's entire life.
Yeah.
I got to know Carol while I was writing my book, Descent, and she always kind of grinned and said, "You have it easy," because she was dealing with Beebe's entire life, which was a very long and interesting life.
Yeah.
And I had the luxury of dealing only with 6 years of his life.
So did Beebe and Ballard live good long lives?
Beebe and Barton did. Beebe died in 1962 in his 80s, and Otis Barton made his last public appearance in 1988. He died in 92. His last public appearance, incidentally, was at the opening of the Vancouver, Canada Aquarium. He came in a wheelchair, and he was buried, and I've been to his grave. He was buried at a veterans cemetery in Riverhead, Long Island. You have to get a map, to find the gravestone, and there it is. He was in the United States Navy during World War II as a photographer, and there he was, Lieutenant Otis Barton, or Lieutenant Junior.
You never got to meet Barton in your travels.
Unfortunately, no, and I had the very good luck of running into his nephew, a delightful man named James Barton, who lives in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and he took care of Otis in his last years when Otis returned to Vineyard Sound, where he had originally made his very first helmet dives as a teenage boy. And Otis wasn't in great health in the later years.
Yeah. Well, your book is about two remarkable men, Otis Barton and William Beebe, explorers from another era. The book is called Descent, The Heroic Discovery of the Abyss, and we've been talking to Brad Matsen about the book. Brad, thank you so much.
Oh, David, thank you. It's a pleasure to be on my hometown public station. And by the way, the book will be out in paperback in May.
That's great.
It's still in hardback. So thank you so much, David.